Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Lavey, the Research Events Officer at Swinburne Research. Thanks for joining us for the June Smart Cities seminar series on transport and freight digitisation. You'll shortly hear from Professor Hussein Dia, who is the Program Leader, Future Urban Mobility Program at the Smart Cities Research Institute, and Professor Hadi Gaderi, who is the Stream Leader for Disruptive Mobility for Future Urban Mobility Program at the Smart Cities Research Institute. Before I hand over to Hussein, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. Just some very basic housekeeping. We will have Q&A after the presentations. Feel free to pop questions in the chat or Q&A box. And we'll answer those accordingly. If you would like to verbally ask your question, just raise your hand and I'll enable your microphone. And also just to let you know, this session will be recorded and this will be placed on our website. So if you are recorded, if your voice is recorded in the session and you're not comfortable with that being published, just email me at the email address below and I'll edit that out. So at this point, I will hand over to Hussein with today's presentation. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we present to you findings from a recently completed research study that was funded by iMOVE CRC. So before we start, I also would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located. And on behalf of those present, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. As I mentioned, this project was funded by the iMOVE CRC, so I would like to acknowledge their contribution, and also I would like to acknowledge the Department of Infrastructure, who also participated in this project, and also the other researchers from Swinburne, including Russell, Sohani, Payway. The research also included a stakeholder consultation, so I would like to acknowledge Swinburne's Research Ethics Committee, who reviewed the surveys and approved the stakeholder consultation. So today we'll take you through the research aims of the study, the framework for understanding digitalization that we came up with, also the benchmarking of best practice. Hadi will take us through the stakeholder consultations findings, and I'll conclude with some policy lessons and recommendations in addition to future research directions for this topic. So I think this research acknowledges the important role of digitization and digitalization of transport in improving safety, efficiency, and productivity of the transport sector. It aimed to basically identify best practices and case studies, what were their benefits, what were the success factors, and what are the learnings for Australia in that regard. And then to do the benchmarking of best practice, we focused on OECD countries. And then we took the learnings, did the stakeholder consultations, and as I mentioned, essentially the aim was also to identify what are the policy levers and strategies that can be implemented to drive digitalization further in Australia. So this is the framework that guided the study. So essentially, governments, communities have policies and objectives at the top. This could include, traveler well-being, sustainability, economic viability. To deliver these in a transport sense, you need to have a number of sectors, industries and services, road transport, rail, aviation, and so forth. And all of this ecosystem, if you like, is supported by a smart mobility platform, which is based on digital technologies and infrastructure and services. And these are also in turn supported by enabling technologies like AI, electrification, machine learning, and so forth. So we divided the transport sector into 7 sectors: road, public transport, freight, rail, airports and aviation, maritime and active transport. And within each of these 7 sectors, we identified what we call functional areas. So for example, within the road sector, one of the functional areas is road safety, another is managed motorways, demand management, and so forth. So in total, we had 40 functional areas that are basically amenable to digitalization applications, and where we can, if it's properly digitalized, it can lead to gains in productivity in the economy. So like with other research, we started with a comprehensive literature review. We looked at the Scopus databases and industry and public sources, and we did a bibliometric analysis. You can find the final report for this study on the iMOVE CRC website, and through it, you'll be able to look at a more detailed analysis of the literature. We set out to review and analyze the best practice through some case studies that we identified in the literature, and there are many of them. I'll take you like some examples. The report has 40 of these tables, one for each of the functional areas. But for example, if we're looking at the adaptive traffic signal control systems, it says, description of it, what does it do? Examples, what are the enabling technologies, what are the benefits in terms of reduction of delays, improvement in travel time, reductions in emissions, and so forth. What are the level of maturity for different systems, their reliability, and importantly, for each of these functional areas, we set out to identify benefit cost ratios, to identify the importance of these in the economy as well. And again, looking at the standards, the interoperability, and what were the success factors from the case studies that we identified. An important aspect of this study is we identified the BCRs for a large number of functional areas and applications. So as you can see here, for parking management, you could have a benefit cost ratio, upper range 4 and lower range, below 2, for example. And you can see like video surveillance and monitoring has a much, much larger BCR. I mean, in comparison, if you compare this to the BCRs we get when we build new roads or tunnels or infrastructure, we would be lucky to get a BCR of 3 for a new tunnel or road. So one of the advantages of digitalization is you are able to achieve much higher benefit cost ratios, and the initial investment is also much lower. We also looked, in addition to the established technologies and applications, we also looked at some of the future or emerging technologies, including, for example, connected and automated vehicles, AI, IoT, and so forth. And for each of these, we identified, what is the current maturity of the technology? Is it under testing, or is it well tested and gradually being implemented? And we also identified what the impact of these technologies could be in each of a number of transport efficiency, socioeconomic areas as well. And then we started to look at doing a benchmarking of OECD countries to come up with indices that reflect best practice transport and freight digitalization. To do this, we ended up having 10 international indicators that are divided in 3 pillars. The first pillar is productivity. And the first item in that productivity is the BCR-informed best practice indices that we developed in this study. There are 40 of them. But in addition, there are a number of global indices that reflect different aspects of productivity. So for example, the one you see in the screen here is the digital competitiveness ranking. These have been going on for a number of years. Another pillar is the industry and consumer acceptance. And the third type or third category of pillars is the policy and regulations. So this table, for example, summarizes for each of these global indices, the ranking for each of the OECD countries. There are 38 countries included. And as you can see, for example, Australia, based on just these global indices, ranked, for example, 15 out of 38. In particular, Australia ranked quite low on this network connectivity index, which is essentially broadband speed measurements. But I want to highlight it here because we identified another study that also has reflections on this particular item. And then the core of the study was developing the indices for the functional areas. The way we arrived at these is by reviewing the technical literature, the case studies, annual reports for transport agencies, government agencies, and also looking at the scale of deployment of each of the technologies. Because as you would appreciate, a certain country that has only 10 advanced systems of a traffic control system, the productivity gains are going to be much lower than a country where you have thousands of these rolled out. And then we came up with a traffic signal or traffic light color-coded index where green represents best practice. So I'll take you through some examples, and the final report has many more of these tables. So this is, for example, looking at the road sector. Okay, so for each of the functional areas, road safety, road rail intersection safety, managed motorways, demand management, we identified these indices for each of the OECD countries. We identified the benefit cost ratios, and then with the country digitalization index, we came up with a road digitalization index score and then a ranking of the OECD countries. We represented this on a radial diagram, and this is good for visualization. If you look at this, if it's a perfect circle, it means it's best practice distributed everywhere. If you see a lot of spikes, it means the practice is really uneven, and some countries are more advanced than others. This is an example from public transport, and again, for each of the functional areas, came up with an index, combined it with the country digitalization index to come up with an index for public transport across each of these countries. You will find many of these diagrams in the final report. We kept comparing everything to road because the road sector in transport has been probably receiving the most funding globally in terms of digitalization. Some countries have been working in this space since the 1970s. So, and as you will notice in the slides, you will find that the road sector had actually the highest level of digitalization globally. This is the freight sector, and similar thing for each of the functional areas came up with these indices. And this again, freight compared to road sector. And you will see in the report, for example, for each of the freight digitalization indices, we also relied on some publicly available indicators which are included in the report. Maritime was probably the least digitalized and the one that has most potential for incremental change and step change, if you like, by improving the digitization first and then digitalization practices. And again, compared to the road sector. So we combined all of this. So for each of the sectors, we identified the index, and then we came up with an overall index and an overall ranking. So you can see here that Australia overall in transport and freight digitalization ranked number 13 out of 38 OECD countries included in the study. South Korea ranked number 1, followed by Netherlands, Japan, US, Switzerland, and so forth. Probably if, because Singapore is not an OECD country, was not included, probably if it was included, Singapore would probably be among the top 3 or 5 countries, because they have been driving a lot of this over the past 20 or 30 years. Now, again, this is how the overall picture looks. And again, you can see that the road sector overall had more digitalization. We then also looked at doing a regional grouping because, for example, Australia always looks to Korea and Japan and New Zealand, as comparisons. So we did a grouping that included Asia Pacific, Europe and West Asia, America, and Latin America. And this is actually this diagram. You can clearly see how, for example, Latin American countries need a lot to catch up compared, for example, with other OECD countries. We included in the final report some of the general limitations of the study, and in particular, the global indices. So I think across the board, lack of data and lack of standards in the global indices. Some of the data was quite current, like as far as 2021, others were a little bit older. There were different sample sizes and geographical coverages. And also one of the key data gaps we identified, we would have loved to get our hands on it, is basically in the investment pillar to look at each country's transport technology investment as share of GDP. There are, because usually what happens is with infrastructure projects, they are built and the technology is added. So sometimes it's very difficult to measure that. I think this would be an area where we would like to see more focus in the future because it will help us drive more accurate indices. I mentioned the broadband index, in which the global one, in which Australia ranked low. We are aware of another ranking which was developed in Australia, and this one looked at coverage and accessibility, the minimum speeds, the uptake of higher speed plans, and data consumption per household or individual. Unfortunately, we couldn't use it because a large number of the OECD countries were not included in this this index, and outside of Australia, we couldn't see a lot of literature relying on this particular index. I'd like to stop here and pass it over to Hadi, who will take us through the findings from the stakeholder consultations.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your time participating in this webinar. I'll take you through the stakeholder consultation, which included questions around challenges, opportunities, overall organizational attitude towards digitalization and how to prepare, and also open recommendations. At a glance, we did have 27 comprehensive survey results and 27 participants. In fact, we had 100% completion rate, and 80% of these people were also involved in the freight transport, which is quite important. Traditionally, a lot of discussions around transport digitalization has been around public transport, while freight was sort of ignored. So we also had a very good mix of participants from both public and private sectors, but most importantly, our population represents very high rank and senior respondents. Next thing, please. So first, our first part of the stakeholder consultation aimed to identify the top 3 challenges as a result of digitalization, which are summarized as data-related, technology-related, and government-related. In terms of data, Majority of participants highlighted that although data is an enabler and the blood towards the digitalization, they also had concerns around lack of standardization and nationally accepted mechanism for collection and sharing of data, perceived commercialization of data by the private sector, and finally, trust, privacy, and cybersecurity concerns. In terms of technology, there were also concerns around various digital maturity and disparity of technology, accessibility, knowledge, and capability, and concerns were raised around, for example, some large players who are vertically integrated. They can actually have legacy systems. Would be actually they will be sort of capitalize on these faster, while this could be very different for small and medium-sized enterprises. In terms of government, we also had identified challenges in relation to coordination, consistency, and collaboration. Respondents highlighted the need for further coordination among different levels of government for facilitating digitalization of transport and freight. Different approaches to adoption of digital technologies was also identified as a challenge, as a risk, whether across, but also across private and public sector as well. Next slide, please. In the next part, we look at what opportunities exist as a result of digitalization. The first one was around supply chain and operational efficiency. So participants highlight that digital technologies could facilitate the access to real-time and reliable data, which is essential to improve operational efficiency, asset utilization, and automation. Some of respondents also emphasize on the potential benefits of digitalization towards standardization, which could lead to process simplification across the industry. The next opportunity area was around optimized infrastructure investment and enhanced planning. For example, digitalization could play an enabling role in better understanding of the trade and freight patterns, therefore assisting decision makers for future infrastructure investment, and how such data could provide important insights on the key infrastructure bottlenecks, but also identifying demand priority areas in the transport and freight sector. But also, and finally, in terms of opportunities, participants highlighted how digitalization could contribute to triple bottom line and sustainability. For example, of course, digital technologies such as fleet electrification and optimization could significantly contribute to lower levels of greenhouse gas, but also digitalization could assist with risk identification and also enhance safety for both operators and users through predictive tools. Next slide, please. And next, we try to capture what are the key concerns by the industry as a consequence of digitalization. So the first one was again around data concerns. For many respondents, digitalization could arrive with data-related concerns, which could potentially minimize the effectiveness of adoption. First and most importantly, a large number of participants have highlighted the challenges related to cyber-physical resilience of digital systems. The second one, again, around data, was around privacy. As a major issue, privacy concerns could reduce the willingness of users and third-party operators to share data with government and industry. The next was around lack of vision for adoption of digitalization. So without appropriate vision and regulatory frameworks, the industry could end up with significant duplication of digital systems and digital frameworks. So it was highlighted that while the national initiatives could prioritize a particular technology area, local readiness could be very different in terms of speed and scope of adoption. The third concern was around lack of appropriate risk and reward mechanism. So the wider implication of digitalization on market structure and competitive landscape was highlighted. Also, respondents emphasized on the potential risk of digitalization for smaller players as a result of slow uptake of technology and losing market share. And finally, the fourth concern was around safety and social outcomes. While it was highlighted that digitalization could be used as a mechanism to minimize the gap in social inequity, it also was highlighted that digitalization could, if implemented poorly, it could result in higher costs that is passed towards the community and taxpayers. Next slide, please, Hussein. The positive side of this work was around the overall positive sentiment towards digitalization. So in this section, we try to look at what is the organizational and industrial impacts of digitalization and how participants see that. So they were asked to reflect on their organization and how they could be impacted as a result of digitalization in freight and transport. So overall, we saw that almost 80% of participants show a very positive sentiment towards the future impacts of digitalization on their organization, but also at the industry. Very few negative feedback. This was more around the secondary markets, for example, how digitalization could impact on OEMs, and this could actually they could go under significant pressure to fulfill the ever-increasing digital needs of freight companies. And there were some questions and some feedback around unsure or mixed views or perspective on the digitalization, which then again, it highlights the importance of such studies and future studies to develop a clear understanding on how disruptive technologies could impact organization. Next slide, please. Next, we try to assess organizations and respondents' level of preparedness and how government and industry could work together. We ended up with 6 areas. The first one was to be prepared. The first is to have a vision-led role of government and regulatory mechanism. An evident theme was around the leading responsibility of governments in establishing a vision and addressing the barriers and challenges to digitalization. But also it was highlighted that the importance of outcome-based and risk-based legislation as a right approach to incentivize the uptake of innovation and technology. The second was around research and capability building, the need to further research and work with research organizations to conceptualize and also assess the impact of digitalization across the industry, but also how the benefits could be translated to SMEs was highlighted as well. Next one is around collaboration and coordination. This thematic area was focused on the need for further collaboration across both public and private domains. The need for further coordination was divided in 2 dimensions, one between different levels of government, but also between government and industry. Data standardization was the 4th area. Respondents identified that a key area to prepare the industry for uptake of digitalization is around establishment of industry-wide accepted data collection, exchange, and integrity frameworks and systems. This was mentioned quite a lot across the process of stakeholder consultation. Next was around a single national roadmap for digitalization, the need for a single nationally agreed roadmap and strategic plan to understand the future state of industry in the presence of digital technology and digital disruption was clearly recognized by several participants. The last one was around cultural and behavioral factors. So in terms of the opportunities for preparedness, respondents identified an area that is associated with establishing a culture for change. Some of them recommended the importance of socializing and sharing the learning through future joint events and planning and collaboration. So this was also interesting. The next slide, Hussein, please. And finally, we just opened the space for our participants to just share the overall view, which to provide us open recommendation. There were recommendations around the new digital models, cyber physical resilience and integrity, collaboration among different government levels. Educational upskilling was very important, data standardization. But one thing that was quite important and was highlighted a few times, was that although connecting with local governments was identified as an opportunity area, it was emphasized that digitalization and data-focused efforts should be initiated, funded, and led by the federal government, as it would be very complex and costly to expand state-based systems to a national level. Next slide, please. And finally, just very summary thematic areas, we have realized that data was seen as a core topic within this consultation, but also it was seen as a double-edged sword. So while access to reliable and quality data was identified as a catalyzer for digital growth and innovation in the transport and freight sector, we identified the challenges with its implementation of data capturing and data sharing, and the need for having a nationally accepted system for collection of and exchange of data in both freight and public transport. Next one was again highlighted across the consultation that the government should play a leader and as a connector as well. So vision-based leadership from the government as part of the nationally accepted roadmap was again highlighted. And finally, I think personally, looking at the inputs, what was very obvious was that the positive sentiment from the industry and from the public and private sector, both types of respondents, towards the adoption of digitalization and the opportunities that we could create with digitalization. Finally, we had some limitation, of course, with such study. This study was completed in a 3-month period, so there was limitation in terms of the number of people, also the stakeholders. But overall, I think we're pretty confident that we have captured a pretty clear picture of industry's view towards the digitalization. Thank you, Sven. This is from my side.
Thank you so much, Hadi. So the next step, we started to look at what are the policy lessons. So those nations that scored high, what were some of the common themes? So for example, they all had very well established national visions, commitment to funding of research, commitment of funding trials and field studies, commitment to bringing and establishing partnerships between government, but also to encourage private investment. As Hadi mentioned, this always keeps coming up, standardization. And in more recent times as well, the cybersecurity aspects coming in. These leading nations had relentless and continuous investment in R&D and education. There was a lot of planning for deployment, and importantly, their investments were all performance-based. So it wasn't politically driven, etc. Everything was treated on benefit-cost ratio and the productivity gains and outcomes that can be achieved for the economy. Some of the recommendations we came up with as well is clearly the first one is to develop a national vision for smart mobility. Although Singapore was not included in the evaluation, we had a look at some of the advancements they're doing there. They have a smart nation, Singapore, and a very core part of their plan there is to have transport recognized. Alongside internet and broadband, etc., as a mechanism to drive innovations and productivity in the economy. So looking at building on what Australia currently has, for example, the digital economy strategy, and looking at develop a national vision for smart transport across the nation. And then we noticed there was a large number of bodies who are doing different studies. So looking to harmonize the policies and align the digital transport initiatives with the national strategy or national development vision. Third, looking at supporting commercialization of research, we identified that even though Australia ranks quite high amongst OECD countries in terms of the research output, if you like. The Australia ranks towards the bottom of the rank, if you like, when it comes to commercialization. So how do we get the research out of the research or the findings of research out of academic institutions and translate that into meaningful technologies for people and industries? We also looked at how some of these leading nations, again, relentlessly invested in digitalization infrastructure. You can see some examples about what South Korea, Japan have done, and particularly South Korea. That's probably why it has been ranked the highest across this, is really over the years, continuously, regardless of which government is in power, there is a national vision. We need to get there. This is the amount of investment we need to do every year. And, that, as you would appreciate, resulted in large productivity gains for the nation. Another clear, direction is digitization and digitalization require redevelopment of skills, upgrading of skills, etc. And which we're happy to report as well. We're doing currently another project with iMOVE and the Department of Infrastructure looking at future skills, particularly looking in the face of digitalization. So looking at, what is best practice around the world, what are the other nations doing for upskilling, what are the gaps, up to 2030, 2040, what are the training needs, and so forth. Another recommendation was to look at agreed open standards and interoperability to improve data sharing, and also to probably identify some bodies who can be custodians of the data that is being collected. And, we're recommending, for example, here to take feasibility studies to look at statewide integrated smart mobility operations centers. These could be the custodians of such data where they can clean it, maintain it, and make it available for everyone to use. Finally, we identified some future research directions, and one of the key recommendations there as well is to look at developing transdisciplinary research. By that we mean different partners, but also in addition to the research service providers, to include industry partners, similar to what we are doing with the CRC. And importantly, to help us basically address some of the challenges we see today with the climate emergency, to link the research agenda about digitalization with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see, transport digitalization will feature widely there. We also recommended some items or agenda for what that smart mobility research framework could look like. But we also recognize that this is something that needs to be established at a national level. And probably the best way to do this is through a national summit that can bring, academia, research, industry, and segments of the society to come together and actually decide on that research agenda for the future. Thank you. A full copy of the report is available from the iMOVE website. And back to you, Paul. We'll take questions now.
Great. Thanks, Hussein and Hadi. Yep. So do we have any questions? Feel free to pop those in the chat or Q&A box. Or if you'd like, I can enable your microphone so you can verbally ask your question. Okay, we have a raised hand from Sonda. Just enable your microphone. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks Paul, and thanks everyone for the presentation. Fantastic insights, and thanks for sharing that. Very, very important stuff. It's great to see these results being presented and also being published. One of the things that struck me from the presentation is there are a lot of things that you looked at in terms of also what are some of the best practice things that separates best practice countries from the rest, and how are they able to act and implement on them. You had a slide in there that talked about how to be prepared, which I thought was particularly insightful in terms of outlining all the aspects that you need, such ranging from government regulation all the way to culture and behavior. And I wanted to understand which ones do have an outsized importance, because what I noticed obviously with given that some of the smaller, more densely populated countries, such as and that have a high reliance on trade, such as South Korea and the Netherlands, they rank at the top. Could it be that there's in those countries there's a more of a collective or a national sense of urgency? And if that's the case, the question is, what would that mean for Australia? Thanks.
Hadi, would you like to go first?
Oh, yes, sure. Thank you for your question, Sander. I also feel that you're from Netherlands, so you do have some Dutch accent, meaning that the digitalisation practices are more mature and more advanced in Western Europe. So I also lived there and I studied in that area, so I have some orientation towards that. It's very interesting, and I think this discussion came up in the past as well, because the size of Australia is also matters. We are talking about a country that is very, in terms of population, the population density, population distribution. It's quite more complex to a country such as Korea or Netherlands or Belgium. Therefore, but also the governance is also different, and what's happening at local and state and federal levels. What I can say is this study is one of the earliest, probably the earliest one that is exploring these factors. And as Hussein mentioned, we have started another work that is an extension of this project that looks at the workforce implications of this. So I do agree that there's quite a level of complexity in that regards on how to create a nationally accepted. Well, perhaps what I can add, is examples of such practices is the recent establishment of the National Freight Data Hub, which is a fantastic initiative looking at ways and models and technology to capture standard data across the freight activity nationally. So I think these are good starts. I hope I have answered some part.
And I would like to add as well, Sandra. I mean, you're absolutely right about these nations recognizing an urgency, because unlike Australia, some of these nations don't have the large spaces available to build infrastructure, etc. So they looked at technology to drive very quick gains, and they've been doing it again, I think, relentlessly. Okay, it's not just I get $2 million in a year's budget and then I invest it, or if there is a certain government in power that advocates this. No, it is a national strategy, and you just keep at it until you get it right, and you keep updating and investing more as well.
Yeah, excellent. No, thank you. Yeah, it's absolutely that's the key thing often always, that different countries have different structures, geographies, and so what would that mean? But yeah, I think it's there's lots of fantastic insights in your research. Thanks for sharing.
Our pleasure.
Thank you, Sander. Can I just ask, if you have some ideas, would like to collaborate, please connect to us, and we can of course further expand the discussions.
Excellent. Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sander. Okay, so we have a few questions in the Q&A. So a question from David, was a weighting used in relation on the population to country size ratio?
No, we looked at that. We considered that. We found that it will be, in some cases, depending on which aspect, it will be subjective. So that's a good point and a good question, and we've identified that, and I think provided some explanation around it. We applied equal weighting to each of the indices for all countries, just like many other of the digitalisation indices that we will use that are international did something similar.
Thanks for saying. We have another question from David. He's asking, who were the participants and across which countries?
I think this is in reference to the stakeholder consultations. Is that right, Hadi? It was local only, Australia. Yeah.
Local, but it was across both private and public sectors. We always had everyone from individual states, but mainly very high level and senior levels, at least tactical and strategic levels.
Yeah, because even though we did the benchmarking OECD, the focus of the study was to look at what are the learnings for Australia and what are the barriers or impediments that would prevent us from expanding the digitalization, and that's why we focused on a local stakeholder consultation.
Thanks, Hussein. Just a comment in the chat from Sally. She's keen to hear if there'll be some follow-up in 12 months' time.
That would be perfect. It is such a fast-moving area. I mean, every second day you hear about a new technology or a new application that can help with improving productivity. That is indeed something we would be available, and we would be willing to explore in the future.
Thanks, Hussein. Okay, so it looks like that's the questions so far. So perhaps we'll close the session early. As I said, this is being recorded. We'll distribute this afterwards, and I can share details of the CRC report in the email that I send out. So thank you, Hussein and Hadi, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and keep an eye out for the next Smart Cities seminar in a month's time. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.